Block 1. I never thought I'd have to defend going to grief counseling at my age, but here I am at 64, dealing with a betrayal that cuts deeper than the loss that brought me to therapy in the first place. My name is Eleanor Howard, and what started as an innocent conversation at the grocery store turned into the most humiliating discovery of my life. It was a Tuesday morning when I ran into Mrs. Patterson from down the street. She gave me this look, you know the one, part pity, part judgment, and said, "Eleanor, honey, I just want you to know we're all so proud of you for getting clean. It takes real courage to admit you have a problem at our age." I stood there holding my basket of groceries, completely stunned. Getting clean? What on earth was she talking about? This story changed my life forever. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe and hit that like button. Where are you watching from? The confusion didn't end there. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange interactions. The pharmacist asked how my recovery was going. My hairdresser mentioned how brave I was for seeking help. Each conversation left me more bewildered until the horrible truth began to dawn on me. Somehow, people in our small town believed I was in some kind of rehabilitation program. The reality couldn't be further from that assumption. 6 months ago, I lost my beloved sister Patricia to cancer. We'd been inseparable our entire lives, talking every single day, sharing everything from family recipes to our deepest fears. When she passed, the grief hit me like a freight train. My daughter Sarah suggested I try grief counseling, and after weeks of barely being able to get out of bed, I finally agreed. Dr. Martinez has been helping me process the loss, teaching me healthy coping mechanisms, and slowly, I've been finding my way back to living again. But someone had been telling people something entirely different about my weekly appointments. My daughter Sarah Howard Chen, who's 38 and works as a nurse at the regional hospital, has been my rock through this whole ordeal. She lives just 20 minutes away with her 2 teenage kids, and she's been checking on me constantly since Patricia died. Sarah inherited her aunt's fierce loyalty and my stubborn streak, which means she doesn't take kindly to anyone messing with family. She's the one who first suggested something wasn't right when her coworker asked if I was doing better with my addiction issues. "Mom, this is ridiculous," Sarah said when I called her after the grocery store incident. "Someone is spreading lies about you, and we need to figure out who and why. You're going to grief counseling, for crying out loud, not rehab. There's a massive difference, and whoever is doing this knows exactly what they're saying." My husband, Robert Howard, who I've been married to for 41 years, was initially less concerned. Robert's always been the calm, rational one in our relationship. He's 66, retired from his job as a high school history teacher, and tends to believe the best in people until proven otherwise. "Honey, it's probably just a misunderstanding," he said, patting my hand in that gentle way he's done for decades. "These things have a way of working themselves out." But Robert's tune changed quickly when he went to his weekly poker game with the guys from the neighborhood. 3 different men pulled him aside to commend him for standing by me during my struggle with substance abuse. Robert came home that night with a grim expression I rarely see on his kind face. "Eleanor, this isn't a misunderstanding," he said, sitting down heavily at our kitchen table. "Someone is actively telling people you're in rehab for drug or alcohol addiction. The stories are too detailed and consistent to be accidental gossip. Bill Martinez, not your counselor, but Bill from Maple Street, knew that you have appointments every Thursday at 2 p.m. He knew you've been going for about 6 months. He even mentioned that you sometimes seem emotional afterward, which he attributed to the hard work of recovery." The pieces were starting to come together in the most disturbing way. Someone close enough to know my schedule, close enough to observe my emotional state after sessions, close enough to spread believable lies throughout our tight-knit community. That's when my best friend Margaret Sullivan entered the picture, though not in the way I expected. Margaret and I have known each other for over 15 years, ever since we both joined the Community Garden Committee. She's 62, a retired librarian with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue when it comes to defending the people she loves. Margaret has always been my partner in crime for everything from book club drama to neighborhood politics. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Margaret declared when I filled her in on everything that had happened. "Eleanor, someone is systematically destroying your reputation, and we need to investigate this like the serious matter it is. I've got connections all over this town from my library days, and I'm going to find out exactly where these rumors started and how far they've spread." Margaret's approach was methodical. She began casually bringing up my name in conversations with mutual acquaintances, pretending she'd heard something, but wasn't sure of the details. What she discovered over the next week made my blood run cold. The rumors weren't just random gossip. They were crafted with enough truth mixed in to be believable. Someone had told people that my sister's death had sent me over the edge and that I'd turned to pills and alcohol to cope. They'd mentioned that my family was getting me help and that I was working hard to get better. The stories explained my weight loss, actually from grief and stress, and my absence from social events, because I was mourning, as signs of addiction and recovery. "Eleanor, this is character assassination," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. "Whoever is doing this knows you well enough to make the lies believable, but they're cruel enough to destroy your reputation in the process. We need to figure out who has both the access to information about your life and the motivation to hurt you like this." As we sat in my living room, going over everything Margaret had learned, a horrible possibility began to form in my mind. There was only one person outside my immediate family who knew all the details of my counseling schedule, who had observed my emotional state during this difficult time, who I'd confided in about my struggles with grief and healing. But surely not. Surely the person I'd trusted with my deepest pain wouldn't be the same person spreading lies about me throughout our community. The trap I'd missed finally sprang shut. The horrible suspicion that had been forming crystallized into certainty when I remembered something that made my stomach drop. 3 weeks ago, I'd run into Janet Morrison at the pharmacy while picking up my prescription for sleep aids, something my doctor had prescribed to help with the insomnia that came with grief. Janet had been behind me in line, and I'd turned around to say hello, not thinking to hide what I was carrying. "Oh my goodness, Eleanor, how are you holding up?" she'd asked, her eyes immediately dropping to the prescription bag in my hands. At the time, I'd thought her concern was genuine. "I'm managing," I'd told her. "Just having trouble sleeping since Sarah passed. You know how it is." Janet had nodded sympathetically. "Of course, honey. Are you getting help? I mean, professional help?" I'd explained about Dr. Peterson and the grief counseling, grateful to have someone to talk to who seemed to understand. Janet had listened intently, asking questions about my schedule, expressing concern about my weight loss, commenting on how different I seemed lately. Now, sitting with Margaret in my living room, those innocent questions felt anything but innocent. "Margaret, I think I know who's been spreading these rumors," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "Who?" "Janet Morrison." Margaret's expression hardened immediately. "That woman. I should have known. Eleanor, tell me everything about your interactions with Janet recently. Every single detail." As I recounted the pharmacy encounter and several other conversations I'd had with Janet over the past month, Margaret's face grew increasingly grim. She was taking notes in her neat librarian handwriting, underlining certain phrases. "Look at this pattern," Margaret said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "She asked about your medication, your counseling schedule, your family's concern for you. Then she takes those genuine details and twists them into something sinister. The prescription sleep aids become addiction medication. The grief counseling becomes rehab. Your family's loving support becomes an intervention. I felt sick. But why would Janet do this to me? We've known each other for years. We served on the church committee together. Eleanor, think about it. What happened right before Sarah died? What committee position were you and Janet both interested in? My heart sank as I remembered. The Memorial Garden chairmanship. Exactly. And who was chosen for that position? I was, but I had to step down after Sarah died. I couldn't handle the responsibility while grieving. Margaret nodded grimly. And who stepped into that role? Janet did. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. But surely she wouldn't destroy my reputation just for a volunteer position. Wouldn't she? Eleanor, that position comes with a $15,000 budget and the respect of the entire community. Plus, if your reputation is damaged enough, you'll never be considered for leadership roles again. Janet doesn't just get the current position, she eliminates you as future competition. Before I could respond, my phone rang. It was my daughter, Beth. Mom, we need to talk, Beth said without preamble when I answered. I just got off the phone with someone from the Memorial Garden Committee. They wanted to know if you were well enough to attend the dedication ceremony next month. Mom, what's going on? Why would they think you weren't well? Margaret was watching my face intently as I struggled to find the right words. Beth, there's something I need to tell you. Someone has been spreading rumors about me around town. They're telling people that my grief counseling is actually drug rehabilitation. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched on for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. What did you just say? Beth's voice was dangerously quiet. I know how it sounds, but Margaret has been investigating, and we think we know who's behind it. Mom, are you telling me that while you've been dealing with grief over Aunt Sarah's death, someone has been actively spreading lies about you having a drug problem? That's exactly what I'm telling you. I heard Beth take a deep breath. Who is it? We think it's Janet Morrison. Janet Morrison from your church? The woman who brought that awful tuna casserole to the funeral and then complained that there weren't enough chairs? Despite everything, I almost smiled. That's the one. Mom, I'm coming over right now, and I'm bringing Dad. We need to figure out how to handle this, because this is absolutely not acceptable. After I hung up, Margaret was already putting on her coat. Where are you going? I asked. To pay Janet Morrison a little visit. I think it's time we had a direct conversation about her recent storytelling habits. Margaret, wait. Let's think this through. If we confront her without proof, she'll just deny everything. Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the knob. Eleanor, what if I told you I might be able to get proof? What do you mean? I mean, Janet Morrison made one crucial mistake. She doesn't know that Dolores Chen and I have been friends since elementary school. And she especially doesn't know that Dolores has been feeling guilty all week about repeating what Janet told her about your situation. My pulse quickened. What did Janet tell Dolores? According to what I learned today, Janet specifically told Dolores that your family had confided in her about your addiction issues and asked her to keep an eye on you at church functions. She said your counseling was actually a court-mandated program. The audacity of it took my breath away. She used my family's love and concern as proof of her lies. Exactly. But here's the thing, Eleanor. Dolores is starting to question Janet's story. She told me she's been watching you at church, and you don't act like someone with a substance abuse problem. You act like someone who's grieving? So, what are you suggesting? Margaret's eyes had that sharp gleam I recognized from her library days when she was tracking down a particularly elusive piece of information. I'm suggesting that Dolores might be willing to have another conversation with Janet Morrison. But this time, she'll be asking the right questions. And this time, she won't be alone. Before I could ask what she meant, Margaret was out the door, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and the sound of Beth's car pulling into my driveway. But as I watched Margaret hurry down the street with that determined stride I knew so well, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to uncover something much darker than simple committee politics. The front door opened before I could even process what Margaret had just revealed. Beth rushed in with that familiar, worried energy she'd carried since Robert's funeral, followed more slowly by my husband David, who looked like he'd been pulled away from grading papers mid-sentence. "Mom." Beth wrapped me in a hug that felt both protective and desperate. "We came as soon as we could." David closed the door behind them, his academic composure cracking as he took in my face. "Eleanor, honey, what exactly is going on? Beth said something about rehab rumors, but that doesn't make any sense." I led them to the living room, suddenly exhausted by the prospect of explaining it all again. "Someone has been telling people at church that my grief counseling sessions are actually rehab, that I have a drinking problem and I'm in some kind of court-mandated program." David's eyebrows shot up behind his reading glasses. "That's absolutely ridiculous. Who would say something like that?" "We think it's Janet Morrison," I said, sinking into Robert's old chair. "Margaret just left to try to get proof through Dolores Chen." Beth began pacing, her hands clenched into fists. "I cannot believe this. After everything you've been through, after losing Robert, someone is actually spreading lies about you getting help?" Her voice cracked on the last words. David moved to the couch, leaning forward with that focused attention he usually reserved for his most challenging students. "Walk me through this from the beginning. What exactly has been said, and how do we know about it?" As I recounted the whole story, from Sarah's awkward question to Margaret's discoveries, I watched my family's faces shift through disbelief, anger, and something deeper, something that looked like guilt. "Mom," Beth said finally, stopping her pacing to face me. "I have to ask you something, and please don't be mad. Have you been telling people at church about your counseling sessions?" "What do you mean?" Beth sat down across from me, her hands twisting in her lap. "I mean, when people ask how you're doing, do you mention that you're seeing someone?" "Because maybe that's how this started." David nodded slowly. "Beth has a point. If Janet overheard you talking about appointments or sessions, she might have made assumptions." I felt a flicker of defensiveness. "I've mentioned it a few times when people asked how I was coping. I'm not ashamed of getting help." "Of course you shouldn't be ashamed," David said quickly. "That's not what we're saying. We're trying to figure out how Janet got enough information to build her story around." Beth leaned forward. "What exactly did you tell people?" I thought back to those painful early weeks, the well-meaning questions, my fumbling attempts to explain why I sometimes had to leave church events early or couldn't commit to volunteer schedules. I said I was seeing someone to help me work through losing Robert. I mentioned having appointments on Thursday afternoons. When Mrs. Patterson asked if it was helping, I said it was a process, that some days were harder than others. David and Beth exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. "Mom," Beth said gently, "if someone wanted to twist that information, they could make it sound like something else entirely." "You think this is my fault?" "No," David said firmly, reaching for my hand. "Absolutely not, but we need to understand how Janet built her narrative so we can tear it down effectively." The front door opened again, and Margaret's voice called out, "Eleanor, are you decent?" "Because I have news." She appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless, her cheeks flushed with cold, and something that looked like victory. "Well?" I asked. Margaret pulled off her coat and sat down heavily in the remaining chair. "I just had a very interesting conversation with Dolores Chen. And before you ask, yes, she agreed to help us." Beth stopped fidgeting with her hands. "Help us how?" "Dolores is going to call Janet tonight. She's going to tell Janet that she's worried about Eleanor's situation and ask for more details about what the family supposedly told her." David frowned. "That seems like it could backfire. What if Janet just makes up more details?" Margaret's smile was sharp. "That's exactly what we're counting on. Because Dolores is going to record the conversation." The room went very quiet. "Is that legal?" Beth asked. "In this state, yes, as long as one party consents," Margaret said. I looked it up. Dolores is willing to do it because she feels terrible about spreading the rumors in the first place. I felt something shift inside me, a mixture of hope and fear. What if Janet doesn't say anything incriminating? "Oh, she will," Margaret said with certainty. "Because I also learned something else today. Janet Morrison has been telling different versions of this story to different people. She told Dolores it was court-mandated. She told someone else it was voluntary but that your family was concerned about your drinking. And she told a third person that you'd had some kind of public incident." Beth's face darkened. "She's been experimenting with different lies to see what sticks." "Exactly. And that's going to be her downfall, because she can't keep her story straight." David was quiet for a moment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." My heart started pounding. "What? Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once we expose Janet's lies, there's going to be fallout. People are going to have to choose sides. Your church community is going to be divided." The weight of his questions settled over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about the years I'd spent in that congregation, the committees I'd served on, the friendships I'd built, the community that had carried me through Robert's illness and death. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know I can't live with people thinking I'm a liar about why I need help grieving my husband." Margaret leaned forward. "There's something else. Dolores mentioned that Janet has been asking questions about your finances, about whether Robert left you well provided for." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What kind of questions?" David asked, his voice dangerously quiet. But before Margaret could answer, my phone rang, and I could see from the caller ID that it was someone I'd never expected to hear from again. Someone who could change everything we thought we knew about Janet Morrison's motives. I stared at the phone screen, my hands trembling slightly. The name displayed there made no sense in the context of our conversation, yet somehow felt inevitable. "Who is it?" Beth asked, noticing my frozen expression. "It's Janet," I whispered. "Janet Morrison is calling me." The silence in Margaret's living room was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. David's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and Margaret's eyes went wide. "Don't answer it," David said immediately. "Wait," Margaret said, holding up a hand. "Actually, maybe she should. Put it on speaker." My finger hovered over the screen as it continued to ring. What if she's calling because she knows we're onto her? Or what if she's calling to dig herself deeper? Margaret countered. Think about it, Eleanor. She's been so confident that no one would question her stories. She might be calling to check on you, to seem caring while fishing for more information. Beth moved closer to me on the couch. Whatever you decide, We're right here with you." The phone stopped ringing, and I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. But almost immediately, it chimed with a voicemail notification. "She left a message," I said unnecessarily. David set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Play it." I fumbled with the phone, my fingers not quite cooperating, before finally activating the speaker. Janet's voice filled the room, artificially sweet and concerned. "Eleanor, dear, I've been thinking about you so much today. I ran into Dolores at the pharmacy, and she seemed so worried about you. I hope everything is going well with your program. I know how hard these things can be, but please know that we're all praying for your recovery. I was wondering if you might want to have lunch this week. I have some thoughts about how the church community might be able to better support you during this difficult time. Call me back when you can, sweetie." The message ended, and the four of us sat in stunned silence. "She ran into Dolores at the pharmacy," Margaret said slowly. "That means Dolores hasn't called her yet." "Did you hear how she paused before saying program?" Beth asked, her voice tight with anger. "And then she said, recovery? She's not even trying to be subtle." David's jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping. "She wants to have lunch to discuss how the church can better support you. She's planning to make this even more public." I felt sick. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the arm of Margaret's floral couch to steady myself. The fabric was soft under my fingers, worn smooth by years of family gatherings and quiet conversations. How had I ended up here, in my friend's living room, listening to someone systematically destroy my reputation? "Eleanor?" Margaret's voice was gentle. "How are you feeling?" "Angry," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "I'm angry. She's enjoying this. Did you hear the tone in her voice? She's loving every minute of being the concerned friend with inside information." "Good," David said firmly. "Anger is better than hurt right now. Anger will help you fight back." Margaret was already reaching for her own phone. "I'm calling Dolores. If Janet ran into her at the pharmacy, then our timeline just moved up. We need to set up that recorded conversation before Janet has a chance to do more damage." As Margaret dialed, I looked around the room that had become our war room. The afternoon light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Margaret's bookshelves were filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived, and framed photos of family gatherings smiled down at us from every surface. This was what Janet was threatening to take away from me. Not just my reputation, but my place in the community that had become my second family. "Dolores?" Margaret said into her phone. "We need to move faster than we thought." I could hear the murmur of Dolores's voice through the speaker, but couldn't make out the words. "Janet called Eleanor and left a voicemail. She mentioned running into you at the pharmacy. Yes, I think she's planning something bigger. Can you call her tonight?" Beth reached over and squeezed my hand. Her palm was warm and slightly damp, and I realized she was just as nervous as I was. "What if this doesn't work?" I whispered to her. "Then we'll try something else," she whispered back. "But Eleanor, you heard that voicemail. She's getting careless, overconfident. That's when people make mistakes." Margaret ended her call and turned back to us, her expression grim. "Dolores will call Janet in an hour. She's going to say she's concerned about you and wants to know more about what Janet heard from your family. She'll record everything." David stood up and began pacing Margaret's small living room, his long strides eating up the space between the couch and the fireplace. What if Janet smells a trap? Dolores did help spread the rumors initially. "That actually works in our favor," Margaret said. "Janet will see Dolores as an ally, Someone who's already bought into the story? She'll want to give her more ammunition. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the conversation that would happen in an hour. Janet, probably in her pristine kitchen with its granite countertops and fresh flowers, settling in for a good gossip session. Dolores, nervous but determined, asking the right questions to get Janet to hang herself with her own lies. "There's something else," I said, opening my eyes. Before the phone rang, Margaret was about to tell us what kind of questions Janet has been asking about my finances. Margaret's expression darkened. According to Dolores, Janet has been very curious about whether Robert had life insurance, whether you own your house outright, that sort of thing. She's been framing it as concern, wondering if financial stress might be contributing to your supposed drinking problem. The room went very quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, dangerous. "She's not just destroying your reputation for fun," David said, stopping his pacing to look directly at me. "She's building a case for something." "A case for what?" Beth asked, though from her tone, I could tell she was already piecing it together. "Think about it," David continued, running his hands through his hair. "If Eleanor is supposedly an unstable alcoholic who can't manage her grief, who can't be trusted to make sound decisions, someone might need to step in and help her with those financial matters Janet's been asking about," Margaret finished quietly. The words hit me like ice water. I stood up so quickly that Beth startled beside me. "She wants to get control of my money. That's what this is really about." "Eleanor, sit down," Beth said, reaching for my arm. "Let's think this through rationally." "Rationally?" I spun around to face her. "My husband has been dead for 8 months, and this woman has spent the last 3 months systematically destroying my reputation so she can swoop in and what? Become my financial guardian? Help herself to Robert's life insurance?" "We don't know that for certain," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't we?" I started pacing where David had left off, my anger finally finding an outlet. "She's been asking about my finances, spreading rumors that I can't cope, can't be trusted. What happens next, David? Does she start suggesting I need help managing my affairs? Does she offer to assist with my investments? Does she start planting seeds that maybe I shouldn't be living alone in such a big house?" Margaret was nodding slowly. "It would explain the timeline, why she started the rumors right after Robert's funeral, when you were most vulnerable, and why she's been so persistent about it, even when people pushed back." "This is insane," Beth said, but she didn't sound like she disbelieved it. She sounded horrified. "People don't actually do things like this, not in real life." "Beth, honey," Margaret said gently, "people do much worse things for much less money." I stopped pacing and looked at my 3 friends, these people who had rallied around me when I needed them most. David, who had driven over immediately when Margaret called him, even though he had an early meeting tomorrow. Beth, who had held my hand through this entire awful evening. Margaret, who had spent weeks quietly investigating to help me. "I need to know how much she knows," I said. "About my actual financial situation, I mean." "What do you mean?" David asked. I took a deep breath. Robert was very good with money, very careful. The life insurance alone is substantial, but there are investments, retirement accounts. The house is paid off. If someone wanted to take advantage of a grieving widow, I'd be a very attractive target. "Jesus," Beth whispered. "How would Janet even know about any of this?" Margaret asked. I thought back to those first weeks after the funeral, when everything had been a blur of casseroles and condolence calls. "She offered to help with paperwork. Said she'd been through it with her mother's estate and knew how overwhelming it could be. I didn't take her up on it, but she was persistent. kept asking if I was sure I could handle everything alone. And when you didn't bite, David said, she decided to create a situation where you might not have a choice. The phone rang again, startling all of us. Margaret glanced at the clock on her mantel. That's probably Dolores. She said she'd call before she talked to Janet. But when Margaret picked up the phone, her face went white. Janet? Oh, hello. No, I was just... Yes, Eleanor is here. My stomach dropped. Janet was calling Margaret directly, and I was trapped in the middle of Margaret's living room with no way to escape without being seen. Actually, Janet, this isn't a great time, Margaret said, but Janet's voice kept going, loud enough that we could all hear she was upset about something. David gestured frantically toward Margaret's kitchen, and Beth grabbed my arm, pulling me in that direction. But it was too late. Is that Eleanor I hear? Janet's voice came clearly through the phone. Margaret, is she there with other people? Because I just got the strangest call from Dolores, and I think there's something you all need to know about what Eleanor has been telling people. Margaret's eyes met mine across the room, and I could see the panic there matching my own. Janet's voice continued streaming through the phone, sharp with indignation. Margaret, I need you to put me on speaker. This involves all of you, and I think it's time we cleared the air about what's really been going on. Janet, I don't think that's necessary, Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled. But her hand was already reaching for the speaker button, and I realized she was making a calculated decision. Better to face this head-on than let Janet control the narrative any longer. The speaker crackled to life, and Janet's voice filled Margaret's cozy living room like an unwelcome storm. I know you're all there. David, Beth, I can hear you breathing. Beth's face had gone pale, but David stepped forward, his jaw set. We're here, Janet. What exactly did you want to say? What I want to say is that I'm hurt. Deeply hurt. I've been trying to be a good friend to Eleanor through an incredibly difficult time, and apparently you've all been sitting around making up conspiracy theories about me. I felt my chest tighten with familiar doubt. This was what Janet did best, this mixture of wounded innocence and subtle accusation that made you question your own perceptions. Dolores called me in tears, Janet continued. Said Margaret had been asking terrible questions about me, suggesting I'd been spreading lies about Eleanor's grief counseling. As if I would ever do such a thing. Margaret's living room felt smaller suddenly. The warm lamplight that had seemed so comforting now, highlighting the tension etched on all our faces. Beth moved closer to me, her presence a solid anchor in the emotional chaos Janet was creating. Janet, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. We know you've been telling people I'm in rehab. The silence that followed stretched so long I wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Janet's laugh came through the speaker, brittle and sharp. Eleanor, honey, I think your grief might be affecting your judgment more than we realized. I would never say such a thing. What would be the point? David leaned forward toward the phone. The point would be making Eleanor look unreliable so she'd need help managing her affairs. Help that you conveniently kept offering. David Mitchell, that is the most insulting thing anyone has ever said to me. I cannot believe you would suggest I would manipulate a grieving woman for money. What kind of person do you think I am? But there was something in Janet's tone now, a slight shrillness that hadn't been there before. Margaret caught it too. I could see the recognition in her eyes. The kind of person who asks very detailed questions about insurance policies and investment accounts, Margaret said quietly. The kind who shows up with legal documents and offers to help with estate planning. The kind who gets angry when that help is declined. Beth's hand found mine, squeezing tight. Through the large front window of Margaret's living room, I could see the streetlights casting long shadows across her lawn, everything looking normal and peaceful, while our small world tilted on its axis. I was being helpful, Janet said, but the defensive edge was stronger now. Robert would have wanted someone to look out for Eleanor's interests, someone with experience. Experience in what exactly? David asked. Because I looked into your background, Janet. Your mother didn't have an estate to settle. She died in a nursing home with nothing but debts. The silence this time was different, charged with the electricity of a lie finally exposed. I could hear Janet breathing through the speaker, quick and shallow. "How dare you investigate me?" she said finally. "How dare any of you? I've done nothing but try to be a friend." "Friends don't spread rumors about addiction," Beth said, speaking for the first time since Janet's call began. "Friends don't try to isolate people from their support systems." "I never said Eleanor was an addict," Janet snapped. "If people drew their own conclusions from seeing her going to that building 3 times a week, that's hardly my fault." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's living room, with its comfortable furniture and family photos, felt like a courtroom where the defendant had just confessed. "So you did follow me?" I said. "You did see where I was going, and you let people believe what they wanted to believe." "I was concerned about you, Eleanor. You were behaving strangely, being secretive. I thought if people knew you were struggling, they'd be more understanding." David shook his head. "Understanding enough to think she couldn't handle her own financial decisions?" "I never suggested any such thing." "No," Margaret said. "You just positioned yourself as the helpful friend who could step in when things got too overwhelming. Very convenient." I looked around at my 3 friends, these people who had spent their evening unraveling Janet's web of manipulation, and felt something shift inside me. The guilt and self-doubt that had plagued me for weeks began to transform into something cleaner and stronger. "Janet," I said, "I want you to stop calling me. I want you to stop coming by my house. And I want you to stop talking about me to anyone. Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. You need people who care about you, and You've been lying to people about me for months," I interrupted. "That's not caring. That's something else entirely." The phone line crackled with static, and when Janet spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the hurt, caring friend. What remained was cold and sharp. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor. A big one. When you realize how much you need help managing everything Robert left behind, don't come crying to me." The line went dead. We all stared at the phone for a long moment, processing what had just happened. Then Beth let out a shaky breath. "Did she just threaten you?" Before anyone could answer, Margaret's front door began rattling with urgent, insistent knocking. The knocking grew more insistent, echoing through Margaret's quiet house like gunshots. We all froze, exchanging glances that said what none of us wanted to voice. Janet had just hung up, and now someone was pounding on the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Janet's final words replayed in my mind, but it was her tone that chilled me most. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing something calculating and cold underneath. How had I never seen it before? "Should I answer it?" Margaret whispered, though we all knew she was thinking the same thing I was. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving in silence that felt somehow worse than the noise. I found myself holding my breath, waiting. The house creaked around us, every small sound magnified. "Maybe it was just a delivery or something," Beth offered, but her voice lacked conviction. David moved quietly to the window and peered through the curtain. There's a car in the driveway I don't recognize. Blue sedan. My stomach dropped. That's Janet's car. We all looked at each other, the weight of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. Janet had called, been confronted with her lies, made what sounded suspiciously like a threat, and now she was here. The progression felt both surreal and terrifyingly logical. She drove here while we were on the phone? Margaret asked. She must have been close by, I said, and the implications of that made my skin crawl. Had she been watching Margaret's house? Had she seen me come here tonight? The knocking resumed, more aggressive this time, accompanied by Janet's voice calling out, "Eleanor, I know you're in there. We need to talk about this misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. Even now, even after we'd caught her red-handed in her web of lies, she was still trying to reframe everything. I felt a flash of anger so pure it surprised me with its intensity. "I don't want to see her," I said quietly. "I don't want to talk to her." "Then you don't have to," David said firmly. "We don't have to answer the door." But even as he said it, I could hear Janet trying the door handle, could hear her voice getting sharper as she called my name again. This woman, who had positioned herself as my caring friend, who had manipulated an entire community's perception of me, was now at Margaret's door, demanding access. The full scope of what had been happening to me began to crystallize in my mind. For months, I had been questioning my own instincts, doubting my reactions to Janet's behavior, telling myself I was being ungrateful or paranoid. But sitting here in Margaret's living room, surrounded by friends who had spent their evening gathering evidence of Janet's deception, I could finally see the situation clearly. Janet hadn't been helping me through my grief. She had been using my grief, exploiting my vulnerability to position herself as indispensable, while systematically undermining my relationships with others. "Eleanor!" Janet's voice came through the door again, and this time there was an edge to it that made me shiver. "I can see Margaret's car in the garage. I know you're all in there talking about me." Margaret stood up, her face set in determined lines. "That's enough." "Margaret, wait," Beth said, catching her arm. "Maybe we should think about this." "Think about what?" "This woman has been harassing Eleanor for months, and now she's at my door making demands." "I won't have it." I watched Margaret, this woman who had been nothing but kind to me since Robert's death, prepare to face down Janet on my behalf. The contrast was stark and painful. Where Janet had used my grief to manipulate and control, Margaret had simply offered genuine friendship and support. "I should be the one to deal with this," I said, standing up. "No," all three of them said in unison. "Eleanor," David said gently, "you don't owe her anything. Not a conversation, not an explanation, nothing." But even as I appreciated their protection, I could feel something shifting inside me. The woman pounding on Margaret's door wasn't the caring friend I had thought I knew. She was someone who had followed me to my grief counseling sessions, allowed people to believe I was in rehab, and then positioned herself to take advantage of what she assumed was my compromised judgment. The knocking stopped again, but this time we heard footsteps moving around the house. Janet was checking other entrances. "She's walking around the house," Beth said, her voice tight with concern. Margaret pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Wait," I said, surprising myself. "Give me a minute to think." But before I could process what I was feeling, we heard the sound of Janet's car door slamming, followed by the engine starting. Through the window, David watched her reverse out of the driveway. "She's leaving," he said. We all stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her car disappearing down the street. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming, but it was accompanied by something else, the unsettling knowledge that this wasn't over. The silence in Margaret's living room felt heavy after Janet's departure. I sank back onto the couch, my hands trembling slightly as the full weight of what had just happened settled over me. "She followed me," I said quietly. "To Dr. Morrison's office. She actually followed me." Beth moved closer, settling beside me on the couch. "Eleanor, that's not normal behavior. That's surveillance." "But why?" I looked around at the three faces watching me with such concern. What could she possibly gain from making people think I was in rehab instead of grief counseling? David leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Think about it. If people believed you were struggling with addiction, they'd be more likely to keep their distance. They'd think you needed space, or they'd worry about saying the wrong thing. Leaving Janet as your primary support system?" Margaret added grimly. "The only person supposedly willing to deal with your problems." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. She isolated me. She made it so she was my only option for help. And positioned herself to look like a saint for sticking by you, Beth said, her voice filled with disgust. "While everyone else thought they were being respectful by giving you space." I thought about all the times over the past few months when I'd felt so alone, when Janet was the only person who seemed to reach out consistently. How she'd always been available when I called, always ready with advice or offers to help. I'd been so grateful for her presence that I'd never questioned why she seemed to know exactly when I needed her most. "The grocery store," I said suddenly. 3 weeks ago, I ran into Mrs. Chen from down the street. She seemed so awkward, kept asking how I was feeling and if I was taking care of myself. She mentioned something about it being hard to ask for help, and I thought she was just being overly concerned about my grief. "She was talking about rehab," Margaret said softly. "She thought you were in recovery." The humiliation burned through me, followed quickly by anger. How many people in our small community thought I had a drinking or drug problem? How many conversations had happened behind my back? People discussing my supposed addiction with the kind of hushed concern reserved for serious illnesses. "I need to know how far this has spread," I said, standing up abruptly. "Eleanor, sit down," David said firmly. "You're not going anywhere tonight." "But people think I'm an addict. They think I've been lying to them, hiding some terrible secret." "And they'll learn the truth," Beth said. "But not tonight, and not when you're this upset." Margaret nodded in agreement. "Besides, going door to door trying to explain yourself will only make things worse. You'll look defensive, even if you're telling the truth." I knew they were right, but the need to act, to fix this immediately, was overwhelming. The thought of facing another day knowing that my neighbors and acquaintances were whispering about my supposed problems made my chest tight with anxiety. "What if Janet talks to people before I can explain?" I asked. "What if she spins this somehow, makes it sound like I'm in denial or having a breakdown?" The question hung in the air, and I could see the same concern reflected in their faces. Janet had proven herself capable of sustained deception. What would stop her from escalating now that her lies had been exposed? "We document everything," David said finally. "We write down what we know, when we learned it, who told us what. We create a timeline. And we stick together," Margaret added. "Janet's power came from keeping you isolated. That stops now." Beth squeezed my hand. "She can't manipulate all of us at once, and she can't control a story when there are multiple people telling the truth." Despite their reassurance, I felt a chill of apprehension. Janet's behavior tonight, The way she'd circled Margaret's house, the edge in her voice, all suggested someone who wasn't ready to give up easily. Someone who felt entitled to control the narrative of my life. "What if she comes to my house?" I asked. "Then you don't answer the door," Margaret said immediately. "And if she doesn't stop?" The silence that followed my question was answer enough. We were all thinking the same thing. Janet's behavior was escalating, and tonight might have been just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up on Margaret's couch with a crick in my neck and the crushing weight of yesterday's revelations settling over me like a heavy blanket. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and I could hear Margaret moving around quietly, trying not to wake me. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from sleeping on the unfamiliar surface. Through the living room window, I could see my own house across the street, looking deceptively normal in the morning light. It was hard to believe that just 12 hours ago, my entire understanding of my friendship with Janet had been turned upside down. "Good morning," Margaret said softly, appearing in the doorway with 2 steaming mugs. "How did you sleep?" "Like someone who just discovered their best friend has been systematically lying about them for months," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "So, not great." Margaret settled into her armchair, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "I kept thinking about what you said last night, about how many conversations Janet must have had. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I should have said something the moment I heard it." I shook my head. "You thought you were protecting my privacy? You couldn't have known she was lying." "But I could have asked you directly instead of dancing around it." Before I could respond, there was a firm knock at the front door. We both froze, looking at each other with the same thought. "Janet." "Don't answer it," I whispered, but Margaret was already getting up. "I'm not hiding in my own house," she said quietly, moving toward the window to peek through the curtains. Her shoulders relaxed. "It's David and Beth." She opened the door to let them in, both carrying paper bags that smelled like fresh pastries. "We brought breakfast," Beth announced, setting her bag on the coffee table. "And we've been talking." David looked more serious than usual as he took a seat. "We think you need to be prepared for the possibility that Janet might escalate this situation." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "Think about it from her perspective," Beth said, pulling croissants from the bag. "She's been caught in a lie that she's maintained for months. She's probably feeling cornered, embarrassed, maybe even angry that her secret is out. People don't usually respond well to being exposed like that," David added, "especially when they've invested so much time and energy in maintaining the deception." Margaret frowned. "You think she'll try to make Eleanor look like the problem somehow?" "It's possible," Beth said. "She might claim Eleanor really is in denial about having a problem, or that she's having some kind of breakdown. She might even say Eleanor is lying about grief counseling to cover up rehab." The pastry I'd been nibbling suddenly tasted like cardboard. "She wouldn't do that, would she?" "Eleanor," David said gently. "She already did do that. She told multiple people you were in rehab when she knew you weren't. That's not the behavior of someone who's going to quietly admit she was wrong." I set down my coffee, my hands starting to shake slightly. "So what am I supposed to do? Just wait for her to spread more lies about me?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "You're going to tell the truth, but strategically. Not defensively, not frantically, but calmly, and with witnesses." "We're going to help you," Beth added. "The 4 of us can handle this together." David nodded. "The key is to control the narrative before she has a chance to twist it further. But we need to think this through carefully." As if summoned by our conversation, Another knock came at the door. This time, when Margaret looked through the window, her face went pale. "It's Janet," she mouthed. The knocking continued, more insistent now. Then Janet's voice came through the door, artificially bright and cheerful. "Margaret, I know Eleanor's in there. I saw her car. We really need to talk." The four of us sat in tense silence. The knocking stopped, but then we heard Janet's footsteps moving around the side of the house toward the back door. "She's going around back," David whispered, standing up. "This isn't normal behavior," Beth said quietly. "Friends don't corner each other like this." Margaret moved to her back door and turned the deadbolt just as the handle started to turn. Janet's voice came through the door, closer now, and with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Eleanor, I know you're upset, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. We're best friends. We can work this out." I found my voice, though it came out shakier than I intended. "Janet, I don't want to talk right now." "See? This is exactly what I was worried about. You're not thinking clearly. Margaret, please, you're making this worse by keeping her from me." David and Beth exchanged a look that confirmed what I was thinking. This was not how someone behaved when they'd been caught in an innocent misunderstanding. This felt calculated, manipulative. "Eleanor needs space right now," Margaret called through the door. "You should respect that." "Space? From her best friend?" "Margaret, you don't understand our relationship. Eleanor depends on me. She needs me, especially when she's struggling like this." The possessiveness in her tone made something click into place for me. This wasn't just about the lies she told about rehab. This was about control, about owning my story, my struggles, my recovery from grief. "I think you should leave now, Janet," I said, my voice stronger this time. There was a long pause. Then Janet's voice came back, colder now. "Fine. But Eleanor, when you're ready to be honest with yourself and everyone else, you know where to find me." We heard her footsteps retreating, but none of us moved until we heard her car start and drive away. "Well," Beth said into the silence, "that was definitely not normal." David was already pulling out his phone. "I'm documenting this. Time, date, what she said, how she behaved." "She's going to spin this," I said, the reality hitting me fully. "She's going to tell people I'm having some kind of breakdown, that I'm in denial, that you're all enabling me." Margaret sat down beside me. "Then we make sure people hear the truth first." But as I looked around at their determined faces, I couldn't shake the feeling that Janet was already 3 steps ahead of us. And if her behavior this morning was any indication, she wasn't planning to go down without a fight. The question was, how far was she willing to go to maintain control of the narrative she'd created about my life? Over the next few days, the four of us developed what David called Operation Truth. It felt dramatic, but Janet's behavior at Margaret's door had shaken us all into taking this seriously. "She's been doing this for months," I said as we sat around Margaret's kitchen table that evening, "making me seem fragile, unreliable. Now when I try to correct the record, it looks like I'm unstable." Beth leaned forward. "What exactly has she said to people? Can we make a list?" I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the notes I'd been keeping. She told the book club I was in rehab. She told our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, that I was struggling with substance issues. She even told the barista at our coffee shop that I was getting help for my problems. "That's not friendship," Margaret said firmly. "That's systematic character assassination." David looked up from his own notes. "The pattern shows intent. She's not just gossiping randomly. She's specifically targeting places where your reputation matters." The weight of it hit me again. Janet hadn't just lied about one thing. She'd methodically rewritten my story everywhere I went, turning my legitimate grief counseling into something shameful. Why would she do this? I asked, though I was starting to understand. We've been friends for 15 years. Control, Beth said simply. Some people need to be the hero in every story. Maybe she liked being the friend who was helping you through your crisis. Margaret refilled my coffee cup. Or maybe she was uncomfortable with you actually getting better. As long as you were the one with problems, she was the stable one. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times Janet had insisted on driving me places, because you're so stressed lately, or how she'd answer questions directed at me with, Eleanor's having a hard time right now. I'd thought she was being protective. Now, I saw it differently. The next morning, David called with an update. I ran into Tom at the hardware store. You know, from the book club? He seemed surprised when I mentioned your grief counseling. Said Janet had given him a very different impression. What did you tell him? The truth. That you've been in grief counseling since Robert died? That it's been incredibly helpful, and that you're doing really well. He looked embarrassed and said he was glad I'd clarified things. It became our approach over the following week. When any of us encountered someone who'd clearly gotten Janet's version of events, we simply, calmly shared the truth. No drama, no accusations of Janet, just the facts about my grief counseling and recovery. Beth handled the coffee shop. I just mentioned how proud I was of you for seeking grief counseling, she reported back. The barista's whole demeanor changed. She said she was sorry for your loss and glad the counseling was helping. Margaret spoke with Mrs. Henderson over the fence. Our neighbor was actually relieved, Margaret told me. She'd been wanting to check on you, but wasn't sure how to approach someone with addiction issues. When I explained about the grief counseling, she said it made much more sense. The hardest part was the book club. I decided I needed to address it directly. I want to clear something up, I said when it was my turn to speak at the next meeting. I've been in grief counseling since my husband died, not rehab. I'm not sure how that confusion started, but I wanted you all to know the truth. The relief in the room was palpable. Several members came up to me afterward, sharing their own experiences with grief counseling and therapy. One woman apologized, saying she'd wanted to recommend a book about grief but hadn't known how to bring it up given what she'd heard. Janet didn't show up to that book club meeting, or the next one. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Margaret's door, I was finally starting to feel like myself again in public. The whispered conversations had stopped. People made normal eye contact. The coffee shop barista asked how my grief counseling was going and recommended a book about healing that had helped her after her father's death. You did it, Beth said as we walked through the park together. You took back your story. We did it, I corrected her. I couldn't have managed this alone. David joined us on the path, slightly out of breath from his morning jog. Any word from Janet? I shook my head. Nothing. It's like she just disappeared from my life. How do you feel about that? Margaret asked when we stopped at the bench where we'd had our first real conversation about all this. I considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, I would have said losing Janet would devastate me. She'd been such a constant presence, always there with advice and opinions about what I should do, how I should feel, what I needed. Peaceful, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel like I can just be myself without someone else narrating my experience. Beth smiled. That's what real recovery looks like. Not having someone else define it for you. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching other people walk by. Families with children, couples holding hands, individuals like us just enjoying the morning. I learned something important through all this, I said. Real friends trust you to tell your own story. They support your healing without needing to control it or take credit for it. And, David added, they show up when things get difficult without making it about themselves. Margaret nodded. Family means different things to different people. Sometimes the people who love you most aren't the ones you expected. Looking around at the three of them, I realized she was right. Janet had been my friend for 15 years, but David, Beth, and Margaret had become something deeper in just a few weeks. They'd seen me at my most vulnerable and responded with protection, not exploitation. Thank you, I said simply, for believing me, for standing up for me, for helping me remember who I actually am. That's what family does, Beth said, and somehow, sitting there with them, that word fit perfectly. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite your story or control your healing journey, know that you have the right to reclaim your narrative. Real support honors your truth and trusts your process. Don't let anyone else define your recovery or your worth. Remember to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding your authentic voice and building genuine connections. Your story belongs to you.